Hello, you're listening to the West Cork History Festival podcast. My name's Simon Kingston. I'm one of the co-founders of the festival. And you can find out more about the festival and about other recordings of past contributors on our website, westcorkhistoryfestival.org. The talk you're about to hear now was given by Russell Napier. Russell is a remarkable person, a hugely successful investor, writer on investing, but also the founder of the Library of Mistakes, which is a collection of places where talks and discussions on financial history and the history of financial mistakes, as the title suggests, take place. At our festival last year in August 2024, he talked about the aftermath of debt and why it is that we seem not able to learn some of those lessons of past economic mistakes. We hope you find it interesting.
Hello, everybody. The microphone's on. Welcome to this afternoon's session. My name's David Clark. I'm a Dubliner who lives in Scotland and has the pleasure of working with an Ulsterman who's next to me here, Russell Napier. And we work together at a place called the wonderfully titled Library of Mistakes, which is a treasure trove of books on failures, schemes, frauds, disasters that have befallen the world due to the machinations of the financial sector. I think it's important to say, when I used to work at Bloomberg, no one was interested in finance. Sorry, the editor-in-chief used to say, people wanted to be financial journalists, people want to be sports journalists. They didn't want to talk about finance. But finance, as we know, is what makes the world go round. And Russell has made this his life's task, really. A law student turned fund manager, turned historian. He set up the Library of Mistakes in Edinburgh, which I say is free to use, open to all. So if you're ever in Edinburgh, come and visit us. It has 5,000 volumes in a beautiful location. We've got libraries open in Switzerland. We've got libraries open in India. We're looking at Toronto. We're looking at London. So this is a growing movement. And very importantly as well, because I always say to Russell, I do the plug now. Russell hates doing the plug. We've got a course as well, which we sell at our site, librarymistakes.com, an in-person or online version of our course, which is a practical history of financial markets for anybody who's interested in this. So think of this as a taster. Once you hear Russell now, you'll want to go off and buy it immediately. There you go. That's the financial plug. I'm going to hand you over now to Professor Russell Napier.
Well, thank you, David. I'll come here and describe myself as a historian by necessity, because I'm not an historian by training. And as David said, I'm qualified in law in Belfast, but instantly found myself working in the investment business in Edinburgh and didn't know the first thing about it. So obviously I had to educate myself, and the way you do that is the professional exams, which I did. And having done that, still really didn't understand what was going on. And then I latched upon history, and financial history in particular. And if our role in life or in a profession is to keep that learning curve steep, obviously practice is one of them. Being at the front end of some of these great disasters is one of them. But I find the best, the quickest, the easiest and most practical way to do that was to read financial history. Hence, we now have the Financial History Library in Edinburgh. It's called the Library of Mistakes because if we called it the Financial History Library, nobody would turn up. Statement of fact. We have the course. I've written 2 books on financial history. So what I'm trying to get to is it works. It's important. And this morning we heard how historians should never forecast the future because they always get it wrong. Well, fortunately, I'm a lawyer. So we'll see if that makes any difference. So I'm going to do 3 things today. One, we're going to talk about the history of debt and where we are, where we've been, where we are today, why we're in extreme today. And then I'm going to do the very dangerous thing of forecasting based upon this extreme level of where we are today as to what happens next. And I want to stress that often history has pretty limited use in forecasting the future. But if you start at an extreme, and we find ourselves at an extreme in terms of debt, then I think it reduces the available options, restricts the parameters, and it helps you forecast the future. So I'm attempting to do that. Also, Simon said last night in his opening about aftermaths, that it's about who writes about it, who wins. So let me state instantly the winners in this. Hopefully a cheer from somebody in the audience. The winners from this are all the debtors in the world, and the losers, and I hope to hear some great big sighs, are all the savers in the world. Okay, so the problem with being not a real historian is you start with the conclusions and work backwards. I see it's not coming up on the screen, Florian. So let me just run you through some of the conclusions, and then the reasoning after the conclusions. And you can tell me whether you think these conclusions are legitimate based upon the data. So here are my conclusions. We will see, as you'll see, have excess debt. That will be inflated away. If you're a pensioner or a saver, that already has interesting implications for you. To inflate away debt means taking control of savings. The government will play a much bigger role in allocating your savings, whether they're run by a pension fund or a life fund or potentially even money in your own hands. Inflating away debt historically has not just been about generating inflation, as we will discuss. It's about much more than that, so you should look forward to this government intervention, and we can give you lots of current examples of that. There are particular problems in the Eurozone, which I'll come back to, because to create inflation, you need to create money. Money is not created in Ireland directly, it's created in Frankfurt, but I'll discuss how that's not absolutely true, and how money could be created independently in Ireland, France, Germany, and other places within the Eurozone. But the Eurozone has particular problems with excessive debt because of the disparity of debt to GDP between its two main partners, who are France and Germany. One is grossly over-indebted. I don't think I have to tell you which one it is. And the other is very under-indebted. And there's a great tussle which you are living through over that. And that will have to be fought out for the control of the supply of money in Europe, in which Ireland could be collateral damage. So as I've already said, wealth is distributed from savers to debtors. But on the upside, that's from old people to young people. I was hoping that somebody under the age of 40 would cheer at that stage. But anyway, so the consequence of high debt levels is more government and less markets. It's kind of a back to the future. So there's some broad, massive statements. Let's see if I can back any of those up with the data. So this is just to give you some idea of where we are and how extreme the current position is. And I've picked on the United States, not because it's the United States, but because this is the country for which actually we have the best data. And what you're looking at in front of you is not the debt of the government. It's the debt of the whole society. And that's important. I can't tell you how annoying it is to watch or read something where people say, and the debt of the country is, and then what they cite is the government debt of the country. And of course, we have to look at the private sector. If anybody knows that, it's the people of Ireland. You have to look at the debt within the private sector. So what's great about this particular data set? This is the debt of America's government, of its private sector, which is the household sector and the non-financial corporate sector. Now, we don't look at the financial sector. We assume that the finance sector has to be lending to the government, the households, or the corporations. So it's a non-financial corporate sector. So it's the total amount of debt relative to GDP. So if I can make a fairly crass comparison with your personal situation, it's your total amount of debt relative to your total amount of income. It's not particularly accurate, but it's a nice, easy way to think about it. And for America, once again, government plus households plus corporates. This is World War II. And this is where we are today. So not quite World War II. This says 51. I think it's actually 47. But we are off the charts in terms of debt to GDP when you look at those three sectors together. And we are in an extreme situation, and we'll have extreme measures. We've already had some extreme measures. 2007, we had the collapse. 2008, 2009, we had this thing called quantitative easing, which I won't go into, but it was an extreme thing, and we did it. In COVID, we did exceptionally extreme things as well, because you can see how there's this great surge in debt to GDP during COVID. The economy collapses, and actually debt levels go up, particularly for the government. And time after time, we are forecasting the reaction of the governments, of the central bankers, to excessively high levels of debt. Now, that's as far as I can go back in terms of the total debt in the system. for the three sectors, but I'll show you even longer data very soon, looking at just the government, and we'll see just how exceptional it is. So the real reason for being here is, what is the aftermath of that? What can be done about it? What will be done about it? And what are the consequences for you, me, our children, and our grandchildren? So it's excessive. And that's why I think, back to what Margaret and Roy said this morning, does it matter who runs a country? Well, only at times of extreme volatility, perhaps. And this level of debt to GDP is perhaps why we have this volatility you see in society. We relate it to Putin. We relate it to the rise of China. These are all legitimate reasons. But behind it, there is this other story, this big story of this excessive level of debt and what has to be done to destroy it. So just because I want to get the picture going back a little bit before 1947, this is data only on the government debt, but it gives you a pretty decent idea of where we are in a much longer time horizon. Once again, we're using the United States of America, and you can see that we are rapidly approaching the level of World War II. Once again, the stock of debt, and this will be the market value of debt, divided by GDP. We are in exceptional times, and we're not really fighting a war. Now, that's obviously not quite true, because we are fighting a war. America is fighting a war. It's a proxy war in Ukraine. There are other wars that superpowers tend to get involved with as well. But this is exceptional, and you can see historically, the real reason for going back is to point out that the great levels of debt historically were associated with killing people, with warfare. Now, this begins not long after America's Revolutionary War. And you can see the high level of debt, a consequence of raising money to fight the English or to fight the British in the Revolutionary War. You can see it spike in the Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, and it's to do with warfare. And we are not yet currently in a world war, but yet we begin this period of history with excessively high debt to GDP. Now, to be somewhat optimistic, we have in the past solved the problem, and that's really what I'm here to talk about, the aftermath. We've had this problem before. We've solved this problem before. And for many of the people in this audience who've lived in the post-World War II era, well, it wasn't that bad. There's America's government debt to GDP, comes crashing down for 30-odd years, and yet for the average person in society, there was no crisis. These are seen in many societies in America, Italy, France, as the glorious decades. So there is a solution to this. So it doesn't have to end in the crisis that you're perhaps more familiar with in Ireland in recent times. There is another way to do it. So I'm going to talk about all the different ways you can get out of this. But let's start with the ways that we probably can't get out of it compared to the way we've done it before. So American Civil War, and then debt to GDP comes down. How does it come down? Well, they stop fighting. And in the 19th century, governments that stop fighting stop borrowing, because there are limited other things for governments to borrow for. They're not paying pensions. There is no national health care system. The social burdens of now placed upon the state don't exist. So the day the war ends, they actually stop borrowing more and actually begin to pay it back. So one of the ways to get out of this is to simply stop borrowing. But given the borrowing that we are doing is for the things that we all want, the social programs that we all want, it's excessively difficult in the 20th century to do that. The second thing they have going in their favor in the 19th century is extremely high growth. Now, most of the American West is opened after the Civil War. Railways are around at the Civil War, but they expand rapidly. There's a huge amount of extra land, and of course, a huge amount of extra people coming from Europe. So you get really high real growth driven by new factors coming in. There's new land available. There's new people available, and that's not really the situation we are in today. And I should have said at the beginning, when I say the we here, I refer to the developed world. The we is the developed world. The whole developed world has this issue. So America solves its problem after the Civil War by not borrowing any more money. We would call that austerity today. It's politically non-acceptable. I can't really see a government out there opting at the minute for austerity, but also by having this very high level of real growth because of a huge growth in the workforce, huge growth in land, and actually very big technological improvements, something that we could have again, but is difficult to forecast. So I don't think that's how we solve the problem this time. World War I, well, after World War I, you can see there's a bit of progress made in this bringing down, but actually not very much. What we do after World War I, and I want to talk about it in terms of money now, is the victors decide that one of the most important things is to honor the debts of their nations roughly at the same purchasing power as the money was lent. So if you lent enough money to the British government to buy 100 acres of land in 1914, they want to kind of aim roughly to pay that back in money that will buy something similar after the war. It's a commitment to the debtors not to inflate away their debts. This is most notorious with Churchill's decision to put Britain back onto the gold standard. But across Europe, many countries, not all, are attempting to honor the debts in a currency vaguely similar to the one they had before the war. And what that takes us to by the 30s is a great deflation. Everybody, I think now, even Churchill later recognized that trying to honor these debts in the purchasing power of the old currency was highly deflationary and highly destructive of the economy. And eventually by 29, that all begins to fall apart right across the world. So what they tried to do in most countries after the First World War was to try to honor the debts that way. Famously summed up in a quote by a man from Omagh. Well, his father was from Omagh, and that is a man called Andrew Mellon, who in 1929 was the richest man, or one of the richest men in America. And when asked what should be done about the Great Depression, or the economic contraction that was to become the Great Depression, when asked what should be done, he said, liquidate stock, liquidate capital, liquidate labor. In other words, if people lend money to people they shouldn't do, they should be wiped out. We should have this great cataclysmic creative destruction, a little buzz phrase from another school of economics. We're not going to inflate away this debt, we're going to destroy it. We're simply going to default on it. Not the government debt, but the private sector, well, they can just default on it. And then we see the consequences. And the consequences of the Great Depression, we destroy the banks, we have runs on the banks, money is destroyed, bank deposits go to zero in some cases, they go to great discounts. And one way to try and deal with this problem is, let's honor these guys and let's wipe out everybody who made bad decisions. Takes us into the 1930s and takes us into the instability that potentially is one of the major causes for fascism. So these decisions matter, how you're going to cope with this. It is worth contrasting this with another state which made a very different decision in the 1920s, a state grossly over-leveraged called Germany, which eventually had to decide to inflate away its debts, and hence the Weimar hyperinflation of 1923. And those debts were eradicated. But that instability, that destruction of wealth in that form, a form of bonds that was held by the middle classes, destroyed a social system that was also something that could lead to the rise of Hitler. So these decisions on how we bring down debt to GDP, in my opinion, have profound impacts. And we're not going to be tempted by either of those. Now, this is the forecast bit, so this is where we can have a debate at the end. I do not think that any developed world country will be tempted with the route of hyperinflation because of the historical consequences. Not just, obviously, Weimar Germany, but in more recent times in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Part of that chaos was a hyperinflation. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, there aren't really good outcomes from the hyperinflationary route socially. It creates a huge social dislocation, which is incredibly dangerous. And I don't think that Western policymakers will take the route of hyperinflation as the Germans did after World War I. I don't think that's going to happen. Nor do I think we're going to go into the thing where we just say the government can't borrow any more money. We've got to stop, just like we did after the Civil War. We've just got to stop borrowing money. We've got to stop running fiscal deficits. That seems politically unlikely, though we could discuss that at the end. Maybe you've got a different opinion. So now let's go to the next one, after World War II. I think I want to go to the British data for this, because the British data is a bit more useful. So here's the British data, public sector net debt since 1700. So we're going back even further here. So you get a pretty good idea where we are in a long, long history of this. Now, Now, we didn't have a civil war in the 19th century, that was the 17th century, but we did, after the Napoleonic War, actually bring down this debt to GDP ratio for the government pretty spectacularly. Now, that was also done by not borrowing any more money. The government wasn't in the business of social services in any shape or form, so it could stop borrowing. Still plenty of wars going on, but not on the scale of the Napoleonic War. And also had the great growth of the Industrial Revolution, and an argument perhaps for another day, the empire, which may be another reason why the British economy grew quite well for most of the last of the 19th century. So we achieved it without any great inflation. Debts were honoured roughly in the purchasing power upon which they had been issued during the Napoleonic Wars. But once again, can we do this today? Are we likely to see a repeat of the British government, for instance, or a government, any government, stopping borrowing, and an economy that can grow via pursuing a policy of empire? Well, it seems unlikely. But here you see the same thing again after World War II, this golden period where actually we seem to have solved the problem, and we seem to have solved it without any major dislocation for the people of the developed world. And that is what I think is going to happen today. We're going to follow very similar policies to the policies we followed after World War II. So there's the debt, and here are our approaches. So imagine you are the policy maker. You're setting these policies for Ireland or for any country in the world. These are the options you have ahead of you. Austerity, which we've discussed, probably unlikely because of the social consequences, because of the burdens that governments take upon themselves. Default, now I haven't actually mentioned default, but you can just default on your debt as another way of getting rid of them. And there is a problem with that. As you'll see, there's a little Bank of England study which suggests your economy would shrink by 7% if you defaulted on your debt, because if this half of the room has borrowed money from this half of the room and you default, well, that's good for you, but it's not so good for everybody over here. One man or woman's liability is one man or woman's asset. So creating that great big hole in someone's balance sheet doesn't really work. Lehman Brothers would be a pretty good example. $605 billion worth of liabilities. Company goes bankrupt. Well, somebody else doesn't have $605 billion. Now that turned out to be a lot less than that after they worked through the bankruptcy. But it's a very dislocative, dangerous thing to do. And Greece obviously did it. Greece's debt was restructured, not defaulted, but restructured, reduced in value. A lot of it ended up in the hands of the European Commission, the IMF, and the European Central Bank. But it's taken a hell of a long time for Greece to return to any form of growth or prosperity. And up to 20% of the population is left in that period. So it's a form of adjustment, which is an unlikely choice, let's put it that way, for any government to simply wake up one morning and say, we're not paying you back, because historically it hasn't actually been that successful. So I'm not ruling any of these out, by the way. I'm putting them all up for discussion as the most likely path. So real growth is the real one that gets us out of jail free, if you like. If you could have a very high growth in real growth, that's productivity, mainly driven by productivity and the growth in the working age population. You elevate your growth rate to such a high level that the debt to GDP ratio comes down and we all prosper. Because on the whole, generalization again, higher GDP means prosperity. So that's what we're all hoping for. And it really now, looking at our populations, looking at the growth in our populations and the demography of our populations, we're really hoping for that to be productivity or immigration. I'm not going to touch the live wire of immigration, but obviously immigration is another way that one could boost the growth in the workforce, boost GDP growth, and perhaps deal with this problem. But I think this one is unlikely, though not impossible, that it can be this. And the one thing that changes everything is a productivity revolution. And as a historian, I would say the number one driver of this productivity revolution is a collapse in the price of energy. So if we can engineer a collapse in the price of energy, I think the prospects of this happening are higher, and the good outcomes for the developed world are much higher as well. And I have no insight into that whatsoever. I think one of the most difficult things as a financial historian, it may be difficult as a historian to forecast the future, but the thing that really gets financial historians wrong is technology. That often technology comes along, it's really unforecastable. The impacts are largely unforecastable, but they can often be hugely positive. So examples are the canals. The canals collapse the price of coal, therefore collapse the price of energy. The creation of oil obviously, once again, the price of energy collapses. So we can sit back and there is some hope that this turns up, but it's really our technologists that will deliver that route out of this. I don't think it's our policymakers. I think it's our technologists that will do it. Hyperinflation I've mentioned. France after the war is very interesting. France is about a 60% level of inflation after the war and 6% interest rates. Now, I don't know how many people here are in the world of finance, but this shouldn't exist. You won't read a textbook that tells you that a 60% inflation rate is compatible with a 6% interest rate, because in textbooks it doesn't exist, but in France it does. And France achieved that. So imagine how quickly its debt ratio is coming down, because its economy is growing by more than 50%. We're measuring the size of the economy in nominal terms, in the amount of money in the economy. And if you're going to grow your economy at 50%, your debt to GDP ratio is going to come down. Now, needless to say, anybody who owned French government debt in this period is getting completely wiped out. And the French say, well, these people only have money because they're collaborators, so who cares? So there is a moral position here, a moral position against bondholders that says, morally, we don't care about you, and therefore we're very happy to pursue this approach to reducing debt to GDP, which is effectively a default on everybody who lent money to the government. Are we in that moral position today? Well, I don't think so, because I'm looking around the room and most of you are invested in Irish government bonds at the minute, or invested in Euro government bonds anyway, because as my pension fund would be as well. So I don't think we've reached a stage where morally we say, you see all those old baby boomers, they really deserve to be wiped out. Now that time might come, and that's how you justify it when you want to go there. So that's why we end up with what I'm here to talk about, which is the most likely route to do this, which is called financial repression. So we have all these politicians, they're all trying to make these decisions, but the argument is that the debt constraint forces them all to do the same thing. Let me give you what I think is now a really live practical example. Many of you will have heard of a lady called Liz Truss. So what did Liz Truss was also faced with excessive levels of debt. So what did she try to do about it? She said she was going to grow her way out of it. She said she was going to slash taxes, boost growth. That would mean borrowing lots of money in the short run, but in the long run, the growth rate of the economy would be so high, this one, that we would just get out of this problem. And the bond market, the people who lend their money, said, no, we're not going to lend you money to do that because we don't believe you can achieve it. We are going to close this off to you. Now, at the Library Mistakes, I also run a podcast. And I've interviewed Kwasi Kwarteng, who was the Chancellor for Liz Truss. And his view is that the bond market's just irrational. That had the bond market been smart enough to see what Kwasi and Liz could see, then they'd never have done that. It's irrelevant. The point is, they didn't. The bond market didn't let them do that. And that message has gone right around the world. Now, there's an incredible speech by President Macron recently, basically saying, look, that's one way we're not going to be able to get out of this. So we've already tried that one. So what happens after Liz Truss? Well, we get Rishi Sunak. Now, depending on what political party you're in, there are many people who think that Rishi Sunak actually is pretty close to Keir Starmer in terms of his economic policy, because he's being constrained and he's being forced to this route below here. So just before they were ejected from power, the Conservative Party came up with this wonderful thing called the British Growth Fund, in which they would collect all your savings. So this is the savings that you have with financial institutions. And the government, in conjunction with the institutions, would then invest it where the government wanted it to be. So not where you wanted to be, not where your fund manager wants it to be, but where the government wants it to be. So that's a theoretically right-wing government, a government that many people consider to be very right-wing, but a government getting into this business of trying to solve the problem because they couldn't do it via growth. And this is exactly what happens after the war. And the United Kingdom has two chancellors after the war, a Labour chancellor and a Conservative chancellor. One is Hugh Gaitskell, one is Rab Butler. And every time you vote, you get exactly the same thing. And it was called Butskillism. It was a combination of the two names, because the debt constraint was such a constraint that no matter all the rhetoric at the election of why they were different, in power, they ultimately have to pursue the same policy. So to me, if we look at the history of debt and its aftermath, we cannot follow the solution after the Napoleonic War. We cannot follow the solution of Germany after the First World War. But we can follow the solution of the United Kingdom, actually in most of the developed world, after the Second World War. So that's what's going to happen. I think it's already happening, and we can look at some of the consequences of that. So we have to get nominal GDP growth higher than the growth of debt. That's how you get that line finally tipping lower. Why do we want it lower? To make the whole system more stable. We don't want to constantly be in this situation that when any time there's a recession, suddenly we can't service our debts because there's so much debt. So we want to get that number down. So you have to grow nominal GDP, and that's pretty easy. Nominal GDP is real growth plus inflation. So inflation must be higher. Problem. The governments have given all the central banks a target for inflation of 2%. That isn't enough. So if you ask me what number is enough, there is no right answer to that question, but it's certainly 4. It may be 5, but it's certainly not 2. And that has implications for you, particularly if you're a saver, and particularly if a pensioner. Now, how do you create inflation? Surprisingly, given that economists have been around for a long time, they have no agreement on how you create inflation, but let me tell you how I think you create inflation, and that is to take a page from a man called Milton Friedman, who said that inflation is everywhere and at all times a monetary phenomenon. There will be people who differ on that, but it's highly unlikely that you can generate this inflation that you need to alleviate the debt problem without generating more money to generate inflation. Now, that's the job of the central bank today. In the period that I've just looked at, that post-World War II period, that was not the job of the central bank because the governments controlled the central bank. That's the situation, whether de jure or de facto, in the case of the late great Arthur Burns, central bank policy was effectively controlled by the government, and then we made them independent because of the consequences of that. So somehow, some way, the government's going to have to get back into the business of making money. Because without it, now whether directly or indirectly through pressurizing the government, they're going to need to create a higher growth in money to create a higher level of inflation. And that has huge implications for Ireland, given that at least directly, Ireland is not in control of the creation of money. But we'll come back to that. Also, over that period of my career, which began in the late 1980s, we got into a world where the governments let the markets determine interest rates. They said to the bond markets, you can determine what the cost of borrowing is. And really, until really about 2009, they just let the markets do that. And the markets constantly delivered them a lower cost of borrowing. So it wasn't a great surprise that governments were all in favor of the market determining the price of interest, because it was constantly lower, because we had inflation trending lower for nearly 40 years. So people were quite happy to lend at ever lower interest rates. One of the reasons we have this excessively high level of debt to GDP is because interest rates were coming down, and governments and households and corporates wanted to borrow more when the price was coming down. But when the price goes up, as it has now done, as you're aware, interest rates are significantly higher than they were in 2020. In 2020, by the way, they were at a 5,000-year low. So if you're young and you think that was the norm, no, it wasn't the norm. That was a 5,000-year low. So we've normalized it, but can we afford to pay it? You tell me, what will the people of Ireland do if you were told one day that 35% of all your tax revenue was paying interest, and there would be no new hospitals, there would be no more pensions, because the bondholders want their interest? Well, let's see how that plays out in Ireland, Germany, France, United States, or whatever. But this is becoming a political issue because it is becoming such a high proportion of total government spending. And my answer to that is, we will not have another Liz Truss. So what happens in the United Kingdom? The bond yield goes up, and that says to the government, effectively, you're going to have to cut all these spending plans. But there is an alternative. The government can come to the bond market and say, we're not prepared to lend you that amount of money. You're going to borrow at this interest rate. And that's called financial repression. It's a matter of compulsion. We change the regulations of the pension schemes or the banks so that they are forced to buy bonds, government bonds, at a price which we, the government, can afford. That is financial repression. What will they sell? It's important. What will they sell? If I go to see life institutions in Dublin and say, government's just mandated that you have to have 30% of all your money in Irish government bonds, what are you going to sell? Well, I know really what they are going to sell. They're going to sell all the other bonds they own, which may be French, German, British, American, at least at first instance. So we have this great dislocation, and it's a capital nationalism. It's reverting your capital, your savings, back to the home state. Jeremy Hunt's £25 billion British Growth Fund, somebody had to sell £25 billion worth of investments to fund it, and a lot of that was foreign. A lot of foreign investments were sold and liquidated to fund it. So we have capital nationalism. That period I showed you after World War II, where debt to GDP falls constantly, was a period of capital controls. Now, there will be a few people in this room, not many, old enough to remember the age of capital controls. And if you want to shoot fish in a barrel, first put your fish in a barrel. And if you're going to manipulate the savings of a nation, you do need to get those savings into the nation. And that is another part of financial repression. And then it's just unbelievably tempting now to start funding all the things the government wants funded. So back to President Macron, 28th of April, the Sorbonne. He makes a speech with the cheery title. If you think this history festival has been cheerful, you should listen to the speeches of Emmanuel Macron. His speech on the 28th of April was called Europe, It Can Die. Good intro. And then he explains to us all the things that the savers of Europe really won't be allowed to do going forward. And he says it is absurd that the people of France fund the American government. Wow. It is absurd that the people of France are allowed to fund American startups. This is the birth of capital nationalism from a man of the centre. Just think what the rest of his parliament are thinking about. The French parliament as currently composed, let us just say, would be even more in favour of some of that stuff than President Macron. So we're looking at a retreat of capital back to home base. I don't really know what Irish institutions have in terms of local assets, but it'll be very small. The Irish savings institutions are global institutions. The French savings institutions are global institutions. And in a world of capital nationalism, we're asking them to sell everything else and bring it back. So we need to work out what they're selling as well if we're trying to work out the returns on various assets. So that's a very different world. Now, there are people who are very much in favor of it, who really do believe that the state is pretty good at allocating capital, and there are some instances where that's correct. But I'm a child of the 60s, so I can remember Britain's last attempt to do this, and it ended with British Leyland and Concord. So it also has a downside, but the downside can take an awful long time to come to fruition. I think it was 1957 when Harold Macmillan said to the British people, "You've never had it so good." That's true. But if you've been a saver, you've already lost 30% of the purchasing power of your savings if you've been holding British government bonds. So if you like the regular guy in the street, wages were growing well, employment was high, the economy was growing. But for the savings class, things were very different. There's a tremendous interview with Evelyn Waugh. I think it's 1961. It's on the BBC iPlayer if you can get it. And the interviewer says to him, "Mr. Waugh, you were once one of the richest men in this country. Now you're claiming to be destitute. How can this be?" And he said, in speaking in 1961, well into this period of financial repression, with the government involved in allocating capital, he said, "No man has made money in this country honestly since the Second World War." Because in that world, there is plenty of opportunities for people, spivs, corruption, arbitrage, whatever you want to call it. So we slowly segue back into that sort of world, and it's obviously a very different world. So I'm going to speed up, and we're going to talk about how money is made, because this is, I think, in the context of Ireland in particular, very, very important. Now, I put this up in full because if I say it, no one believes me, but if the Bank of England says it, at least half the audience will believe it. So therefore, if you borrow £100 from the bank and it credits your account with the amount, new money has been created. Okay, so the government didn't create the money. The central bank didn't create the money. The commercial bank created the money. Your banking system creates money. It creates euros. When it expands its balance sheet, it creates money. It didn't exist until it was credited to your account. So essentially, banks create money, not wealth. Banks create around 80% of money in the economy. With electronic deposits in this way, in comparison, banknotes and coins make up only 3%. So that all sounds insane. So let me explain how it works in real life. So when you think of the central banker, think of that person, man or woman, as the coach person with a team of horses. And the horses, let's give them 6 horses, are all commercial banks. And the job of the central banker is to push those commercial banks in a way to create the right amount of money for the economy. Now, what the reins that run from the coach person to the horses are, they are interest rates, which might affect demand for credit and the growth in the economy. There's capital that the banks are forced to hold to make them more stable, and by changing the amount of capital, you can hope to influence the growth rate of bank credit and therefore money. There's liquidity ratios. There's all sorts of tools of regulation. And that's the interesting point about this within the context of the euro. Because yes, there is one central bank. There is one ring to rule them all, if we like. That's the interest rate. But then there's regulation. And across Europe, well beyond Europe, the regulatory power of the state, which still largely rests in the member state rather than in Brussels, is being used to generate bank credit growth and money supply growth. It's as if of the 6 horses, suddenly we have a French jockey on one, a German jockey on the other, an Irish jockey on the other, and you're sitting up in the coach with the reins and you're wondering how you're going to control this. In other words, the centralized discipline within the single currency is beginning to break down out of necessity. Because if you look at the list of things that President Macron wants to fund using the savings of the people of France, it is renewables, obviously, defense, pretty obviously. He also says AI. And if the government wants to fund these things, and its debt to GDP ratio is exceptionally high, then it's going to have to turn to the banks. So that politicization of the banks is going to create a growth rate of bank credit, which the ECB will really struggle to defend. Now, the problem for each member state is all the euro is created by France, and France is the biggest banking system in Europe. It's significantly bigger than the German banking. Every single one of those euros is fungible in West Cork, which is not to say it will all come to West Cork, but it is fungible here. It is the money of West Cork, and it could all come flooding to West Cork. So this breakdown in discipline is exceptionally important. I want to skip to one, because I did say at the beginning this is all about the developed world. So just to show you that these debt to GDP numbers are pretty horrific, the chart I showed you ends with the USA, 4Q, 257%. So we're in the 4Q column, that horrible, horrible looking chart, 257. We'll look at the rest of the world, the developed world that is. So you got Japan and 400%, France 320%, Germany 183%, India 185%. So this is not a US problem, this is a global developed world problem. But within the Eurozone, there's a real problem because France and Germany have got a radically different number. And on the day when the euro was launched, it was almost the same number. The debt level of France and Germany on the launch of the euro in 1999 was roughly 200% of GDP. Since then, it's fallen marginally in Europe and expanded rapidly in France. So how do you set a monetary policy? You know, debt to GDP is too high. How can France inflate away its debt without the use of the ECB, without the support of Germany? And I'm going to leave it as a question because I don't think there's an obvious answer as to how we reconcile that, but it clearly creates problems at the center of the euro. On the upside, if you look at all the emerging markets, they have got very low debt to GDP ratios. These are now, with the exception of China, very low debt to GDP ratios. Remember, most of these countries were caught up in the Asian financial crisis and what happened after that Asian financial crisis. And if you like, they've learned a lesson and they don't have a lot of debt to GDP. So it's not universal globally, but it is pretty much in the developed world. I don't have time to talk about that data too much, but this is the percentage of cash flow in the private sector needed to service debts. And once again, a lesson from history. If this number is above 20%, historically above 20%, when interest expense rises, you can expect to have a crisis in the private sector. And I put it up really to show you that the places where that is very high are not where you think it is, because you'd assume it's the United Kingdom and the United States. It's the Anglo-Saxons that we all know love leverage. But actually the data tells you a different story. Norway is exceptionally high, Netherlands, Canada is one of the worst, by the way, particularly in the household sector, residential sector. Sweden, Denmark, China, close to an all-time high. South Korea, Belgium, France. This is not where you expect to find debt problems, but based on the current level of interest rates and interest expense, this is where we might expect today people to struggle to service their debts. And then look at the bottom. Emerging markets, virtually no debt. So I'm going to finish in 1 minute. So these are the things that you don't get to do in a financial repression. These are the things that you didn't get to do in a previous financial repression because the government's steering capital where it wants it to go. So basically, a lot of the wealth that you see, extreme wealth that you see today, has been generated by people borrowing money to gear up an existing income stream. Now, I don't hesitate to call it private equity, but it is more than private equity. You find an income stream, you gear it up, interest rates go down, suddenly you're very wealthy, but you haven't created anything. Now, there are other people who borrow money and invest it and create businesses and create jobs, and we're going to have the state getting involved to say this financial engineering shall not pass. You will not be able to refinance that. So I think private equity has a problem, commercial property has a problem, people who borrow money to buy back their own shares have a problem, and we go into a great long period of re-equitization. There is actually another way to do this and do it really quickly and less painfully. You force everybody who's got debt to take equity. That's the quick way to do it. Now, it's painful. It's painful for all the people who thought they had debt and they end up with equity. But for society as a whole, this may be one of the better and quicker ways to do it. Doing that, however, is political dynamite, given the power of the people who own the debt. So that is my conclusion on why, first of all, the evidence that debt to GDP is pretty much at a record high. 2, that we're going to do something about it. And then I give you the 5 options and why I think it's going to be financial repression. And then the consequences, the aftermath of financial repression for your savers, for your citizens, and particularly with life within a Eurozone where everybody's trying to get different rates of inflation to inflate away their debts. So thank you.
That was Russell Napier, keeper of the Library of Mistakes, talking about the aftermath of debt. A reminder again that if you'd like to learn more about the West Cork History Festival and listen to the contributions of others who've attended over the years, please go to our website, westcorkhistoryfestival.org.